This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
Thanks very much. As we begin the summer season, we are pleased to explain a little bit about what Liberals will be focusing on this summer, and we have decided that we will be focusing on youth. So there's a general belief that the youth today are apathetic, but the truth is that youth are engaged in their communities, in international development, in non-governmental organizations, and unfortunately, youth, like many Canadians, are turned off of politics. Liberal MPs and senators are focusing their summer activities on youth-themed issues as they travel across the country speaking to Canadians. Have a right to be consulted on the country we are going to leave them, not just on issues like student debt. While the NDP and the Conservatives remain locked in a hopeless and polarizing struggle between left and right, Liberals will be engaging with young Canadians, engaging about the issues that matter to them. Members of the Liberal caucus will be holding local events across the country and weekly press conferences on Parliament Hill to highlight the challenges facing Canada's youth, listening to their perspectives, and promoting positive solutions. Canada's youth will play a pivotal role in the future of our country and the future of the Liberal Party of Canada. As we rebuild the Liberal Party, we are taking steps to be the most open, inclusive, and engaging political party in Canada. Speaking specifically about my own file of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, it's important to note that Canada's Aboriginal peoples are the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population. The Aboriginal population in Canada grew 45% between 1996 and 2006, 6 times faster than the non-Aboriginal population, and almost half, 48% of the Aboriginal population is aged 24 and under, compared with 31% of the non-Aboriginal population. Aboriginal youth are one of our most valuable resources, but everywhere I go, I hear about the tremendous barriers that exist to their success. Health outcomes for Aboriginal Canadians are still completely unacceptable, but the government is slashing health funding for Aboriginal Canadians. Suicide rates among First Nations are 5 times higher than the general population, Inuit youth 11 times higher. Yet, despite supporting the Liberal Opposition Day on National Suicide Prevention Strategy, the government cut the funding to the Aboriginal Youth Suicide Prevention Strategy. Cultural Connections for Aboriginal Youth funded youth programs across the country and offered services such as prenatal care, youth employment centres, and cultural camps. These Aboriginal youth programs are being shut down for this year because their federal funding has disappeared. Support workers in friendship centres are now being laid off, and the hard-won trust of many at-risk Aboriginal youth is in jeopardy. This approach is simply short-sighted and narrow-minded. We now only graduate 1/3 of First Nation students. The high school graduation rate for students on reserve in 2008-2009 was 35.6%. But it actually fell in 2009-2010 to 33.3%. We are going in the wrong direction. According to ITK's landmark study on Inuit education, 75% of Inuit children are not completing high school. Many who do not graduate do not have the skills. Those who do graduate still do not have the skills and knowledge comparable to non-Aboriginal graduates. These outcomes are not a mystery. Refusing to provide the same funding per student for Aboriginal education as it provided for non-Aboriginal education is nothing but an act of discrimination. Aboriginal children are more likely to go to jail than to graduate from high school. Yet the Conservative government has just slashed 20% of the federal funding for their youth justice programs. Despite supporting a Liberal motion last November, calling on the government to address on an urgent basis the needs of those First Nations communities whose members have no access to clean running water in their homes, as of April 30th, 2012, there were still 122 First Nation communities across Canada under a drinking water advisory. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food recently toured Canada and reported very desperate conditions and people who are in extremely dire straits, and raised specific concerns regarding Aboriginal peoples. Nearly 70% of Inuit preschoolers live in households rated as food insecure. How can we expect young Aboriginals to succeed if they are living in dilapidated and overcrowded homes without access to clean, safe, running water or sustainable food? The government has promised to work with Aboriginals to close these unacceptable gaps in social outcomes, but has failed to do so. Despite the Prime Minister's rhetoric at the recent Crown First Nations gathering about resetting the relationship, the Conservative government has shown a total disregard for the rights of Indigenous peoples. Liberals have shown what can be achieved when governments work with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and the provinces and the territories in a collaborative partnership based on mutual respect and a full recognition of Aboriginal rights. But this is a government that seems to have a pathological aversion to consultation with those impacted by their decisions. Paternalistic decision-making has been disastrous for developing Aboriginal policy and a total failure regarding policies directed at youth. The Liberal Party will be speaking with youth across Canada about the fundamental issues we face as a country and with all Canadians about how to best prepare youth to fully contribute to Canadian society. I will be continuing my ongoing dialogue with Aboriginal youth as well as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leadership to develop concrete strategies to close the unacceptable gaps in social and health outcomes. In my meetings with Aboriginal students, I have already heard about the lack of government consultation with Indigenous youth, the unacceptable waiting lists on reserve for deserving students to go to university, and about all of their concerns, the need to preserve their cultural identity. I was in Nunavut just last week and heard about the pervasive problems with early pregnancy and about the terrible and systemic issue of youth hunger. Mr. Harper talks about Northern sovereignty, but the people who live there, particularly the young people, feel abandoned by this government. These discussions will inform the relationship a future Liberal government will have with Aboriginal Canadians, a relationship between governments built on respect, collaboration, and above all, active listening.
Samantha Bayard.
Okay, there's a lot of different changes and choices that the Harper government's made that's going to make a negative impact on Aboriginal youth. What do you think is the one change or decision that's going to affect them the most, and we should make a priority to change the most? We should focus our energies.
Well, I think the National Chief and the Prime Minister did agree that they would work on education as that goal, and closing the gap in the education of First Nations children on reserve, that discrimination that we talk about, that the investment in a First Nation child on reserve is still only 2/3 that of a non-Aboriginal student off reserve. But the 2% cap that is placed on post-secondary education is something that people feel really needs to be lifted, as well as the supports and services to make sure that Aboriginal students will succeed as they make that transition to post-secondary. Sometimes that means that there needs to be childcare. There needs to be all of the supports and services, and I think that the conference this fall around transitioning from primary school to high school to post-secondary is going to be very, very important in terms of how we make the investments to make sure that the future of this country, which is jobs without people and people without jobs, that's where we know Aboriginal youth need to be able to get the education and training to be able to fill those jobs and to actually have the economic success that they deserve.
As you know, the former Prime Minister Martin, since he left office, has spent a fair amount of his time and energy and even his own money on the issue of Aboriginal education. In your prepared comments and your response to the last question, is it your view that education and getting at that is the key to solving so many of the other problems that affect Aboriginal communities?
I think that there's a consensus that with education, the economic, health, all the other outcomes improve. And so I think that what we're saying is that we need to invest in dollars in their education, meaning that if the average on-reserve student has $7,000 spent on them, an average off-reserve 10, 11, 12, depending on what province or territory they're in, that's unacceptable and discriminating. But what we also know is that the key to success is for a First Nations, Inuit, or Métis student to feel absolutely, have a secure personal cultural identity, that they know who they are, where they've come from, and that changes to this curriculum, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is talking about, the effects of residential schools, why the role models on both parenting and on achieving educational success and economic success have been destroyed because of residential schools, but also because of the paternalism of the Indian Act. So we are fighting every day to eradicate the ignorance of non-Aboriginals as well in terms of the history of First Peoples in Canada. And so as the motion we tabled just the week that Parliament rose in creating a fund for Aboriginal education to non-Aboriginals, we believe that all Canadians want to be pushing and pulling for healthier public policy, and that means eliminating the gap in the funding around education, but also that we need to know as Canadians that the history and the real damage that was done by the Indian Act and by residential schools. And so, this is next year will be the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation. It means that all Canadians need to understand that agreement between the Crown and the First Nations to how we would share this land together, it needs to be part and parcel of how Canadians see themselves. And one of the things that was really exciting, Mark, was when you look at New Zealand and how putting Maori studies into the curriculum just K-8 and then as an option in high school really turned around the relationship such that the Maori culture and identity is part of the identity of all New Zealanders, and that's something that we are working on all across this country. And from the Rotary Club in Iqaluit last week to Guelph to high school in my riding, I see that the excellent work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, plus the work of Paul Martin Foundation, plus all of us out and about really trying to eradicate the ignorance of non-Aboriginal Canadians, and that becomes as important in terms of education.